Before I get into too much detail, just a quick comment on terminology and words that I'll be using in this webinar. So in politics, we hear a lot of convenient shorthands. We hear phrases like left wing or right wing. We talk about words such as populism. And each of these words have a slightly different meaning depending on culture and depending on where exactly you are in the world. So they are subjective words to an extent, and they are based on political philosophy. And so, again, apologies that it will not be possible to be overly precise in a single webinar. These are words that have different perceptions. And I think in terms of populism, this is a word which is particularly defined in very different ways by different people. So some people will perceive it as politicians, in a positive light, politicians listening to what the public want and trying to speak in a language that represents the public and trying to make sure that that the public will is what actually happens. Other people will see it in a much more negative, insular way. They'll see it as based on prejudice rather than evidence. For this webinar, basically what I'm going to look at for populism is to consider it as the converse of the establishment. So the traditional political establishment, the traditional governing parties, the traditional way of doing things on one hand, and populism being effectively the opposite of that. So in Europe in particular, it's possible to track this. So we can look at the establishment parties, the parties which are the big groups in the European Parliament. And what we've seen over the last 15 years is a decline in the establishment parties. And so I'll just put the graphic on screen there, which just shows basically what's happened from 2004 onwards in the European Parliament. So the parties which are the parties which were the parties of government effectively 15 years ago. So the centre left, centre right, and liberal groups, EPP, S&D, ALDE, which is now renamed as Renew Europe. So those three parties generally controlled the agenda in the European Parliament. Between those parties, they had a massive majority. So they had 601 seats between them out of 732. And so we see that over time that declined up to the 2019 election, when even all of the parties of traditional government and opposition in Europe had lost significant amounts of support. And I think this is not a single phenomenon. It's not something that's just happened in one country. We're not talking about specifically right-wing parties growing or specifically left-wing parties growing. We're actually talking about a mix of those things. We're talking about what we've seen is a rejection, in a sense, of the consensus which had built within Western politics over the previous decades. And so whatever your precise definition is that you choose, then I think it's fair to say that populism has risen substantially over the last decade, or perhaps more precisely since 2004. And so what this talk today is going to focus on is something which is related to that. So populism is one thing, but then polarization is something which can overlap, but very different in another sense. So polarization in Western politics has been the tendency for people of different political backgrounds to find themselves almost not talking to each other. We don't have the same level of debate, discourse, friendly disagreement that we did before. There is very much an us versus them mindset in a lot of things. People perceiving opponents from the basis of a group identity. So somebody on one side perceiving someone on the other side in a very negative way. And that kind of polarization is what we saw, for example, with the scenes in the Capitol building in the USA on the day of the new US president's inauguration. This is what we saw with the violence that accompanied political protests in the United States and in Europe after the murder of George Floyd. We've seen language used by politicians on all sides, which has stoked this polarized us versus them mentality. And I think there's been a tendency, certainly in the Western media, to perceive this as being right wing. And I'm not convinced that's the case. I think it's far more complex than that. And so I'll come back to that in just a moment. But I think there's also a question, particularly when we look at international politics. I'm very much aware that when we talk about left wing and right wing, those definitions change dramatically depending on where in the world you go. So to give one example of that, if we consider a political issue of whether a citizen believes that the death penalty is an appropriate punishment for those who commit murder. Now, that is a moral question. Now, if you look at that question in the United States of America, you would find that the vast majority of Republicans would support the death penalty. The vast majority of Democrats would oppose the death penalty. And so, as a political issue, it is something which, it's almost a wedge issue. It defines what's left wing will generally be opposed to death penalty in America, right wing generally in favor. But if you take that same issue in other countries, if you take that same issue in, say, the Nordic countries in Scandinavia, even the right wing would be opposed in general to the death penalty. So it would be perceived as extreme right wing to support the death penalty in Scandinavia. So what we think of as left wing and right wing, and I'm only using that as a particular issue because it's quite a clear-cut issue. It's one where people will have their own opinion on that issue, and there tends to not be a huge spectrum of opinion. You actually see the same thing, the definition of left and right changes on a range of issues. You'd see the same, for example, on healthcare. Somebody who is right-wing in the UK on healthcare would perhaps be in the centre in the USA. And so these differences that we see are ones which change the perception of the debate. But I would argue that in terms of polarization of politics, I would argue that the aspects of how Western politics has polarized are actually almost independent of how exactly you frame political discourse. And often you also end up, and I think this is where we come into populism, is that you often find situations where the opinion of politicians and public opinion don't always match up very well. So we'll often find situations where the consensus amongst the public might be very much, or the public might be very much split, but politicians overall having an overwhelming view on one side or another. Certainly that's something that we saw in the Brexit debate in the United Kingdom. So the referendum went just under 52% to want to leave the European Union and just over 48% to want to remain. But the politicians at that time, over 80% of politicians in Westminster at that time wanted to remain. And so there was a certain disconnect between the average politician, shall we say, and the average voter. And I think we see, certainly across Europe, we see this playing out, but in very different ways in very different countries. So, and none of this stays exactly the same over time. So you could look at, in Germany, the Alternative for Deutschland party, which was a Eurosceptic party, certainly, but over its time from 2014 to 2019, we saw it transform and move into quite a harsh direction in terms of cultural issues, and would be perceived by most media commentators now as being a far-right party rather than a right-wing party. So a lot of parties shift, and certainly there exists this right-wing populism. We see it with Fidesz in Hungary, we see it with the Law and Justice Party in Poland, we see it in what was the Front National in France, now the National Rally. And even some of those parties, Fidesz, for example, was part of the establishment European People's Party in the European Parliament until very recently. So again, we see these shifts everywhere. So certainly there exists this right-wing populism in Europe. But I think what perhaps is less documented is that there also exists, in effect, a left-wing populism in Europe. So in the wake of financial crises in Greece, we saw the growth of parties such as Syriza from the left side of politics, and that growth there was effectively a populist movement in the sense that we've just described it. We could say the same perhaps about Podemos in Spain, which is effectively a very much a sort of a workers' populist type of party in a lot of ways. And then we have parties that just don't quite fit the mold. So a party like the Five Star Movement in Italy has some right-wing characteristics, but it has some left-wing characteristics as well. Its economics is left-wing, its view on the environment is left-wing, but its political worldview is very much populist. And we see this time and time again, but the fact that this phenomenon occurs across country after country, it occurs right-wing, left-wing, centrist, I think speaks to a change in the perception of politics overall. It speaks to something which would suggest to me that the way that politicians and voters interact has changed dramatically over the last 10 to 15 years. Again, you can see exactly the same in America. You look at Donald Trump as a so-called right-wing populist, but then you could also very easily argue that somebody like Senator Bernie Sanders on the left side in America had that populist approach to his campaigning, but coming at it from very much an economic left-wing point of view. And even in America, you could go one step further and look at somebody like Ron Paul, who stood for the Republican nomination in 2012 on a libertarian platform, which would not fit into those traditional left-right divides at all, but yet having a lot of elements of populism in the way that he goes about it. So I think if we look at how we perceive the political spectrum, I think we're best to look at this in terms of three different things rather than the simple left-right. So you have, on social issues, people can be anything from liberal to authoritarian. On economics, we can have anything from state control, state ownership, nationalisation, and so on, to very much laissez-faire, free market economics with minimal state interference. And those two are both considered left or right, but actually somebody might be liberal on social issues, but conservative on economics. They might be liberal on economics, but socially very conservative. That is probably a better definition than simple left-right. But then I think the third thing is about how those policies are presented. Are they presented by an establishment, or are they presented in a populist way? So to me, those three things together give a much better idea of what's going on the political spectrum. And it's worth noting, when I was in the European Parliament, I would find numerous occasions on which the so-called left and right parties would vote on in exactly the same way. So parties which were supposed to be polar opposites would vote in the same way because they have the same kind of approach to how they perceive democracy. So they would vote in the same way, for example, on wanting greater transparency in politics. They'd work in the same way on democratic reforms. And they'd often vote in the same way when it came, for example, to a number of budgetary matters. So you see this, the political spectrum just doesn't have this simple traditional approach that you would expect to see from basically what you'd read in the media, certainly. I think another thing that causes certainly has contributed, shall we say, to polarization, to this us versus them mentality in Western politics, is the nature of electoral systems. So if anyone's studied political science, you may have come across Kenneth Arrow's impossibility theorem, and he could mathematically prove, and I'll put the link in the document I sent through after this talk. But we know that there exists no perfect voting system. It is not possible to create a voting system which does not have a particular type of mathematical flaw, and that is mathematically provable. So we know that nothing will ever be perfect. And just to go one step further than that, different electoral systems lead to different problems. So in Europe, generally speaking, most countries use a proportional voting system. And that means that people's votes are related to the number of members of parliament that are elected for each of those parties. But it also means that you end up with grand coalitions being formed. So parties of roughly centrist establishment ideology generally work together, and you end up with a lot of situations in countries, and certainly in the European Parliament, where there is a centrist consensus built, which leads to people on the left or on the right feeling that they are unable to change policy. But then when you look at the British system and you look at the first past the post system, where in each individual constituency people choose their representative, you end up with the opposite problem, which is, yes, you get strong government, usually. But you also end up with a problem where you'll have certain areas, so the constituency that I live in has voted for the same political party for my whole life. So, so in my constituency in Sheffield, there has never been a member of Parliament in Westminster in my lifetime other than for the Labour Party. And that means that people who would normally vote for the Conservative Party, the Liberal Democrat Party, or whichever other party, don't have a feeling that they have a say. And it creates this feeling sometimes of people not being able to actually influence what's going on within a parliamentary democracy. It creates a sort of disconnect between politicians and voters. So whichever system you have, there is this built-in potential for this disconnect. And I think this basically leads us to a number of causes of polarization within politics. So I'll just share this. Yeah, so, and I think that first one, I think we've just covered, the feeling of disenfranchisement, the feeling that if people feel that they can't actually change anything, if they feel that their vote doesn't particularly make a difference. The second one, I think, is that the consensus is often not challenged. So because you end up with quite often, certainly 15 years ago, we ended up with this situation where politics would quite often have quite a narrow spectrum of acceptable opinions. And again, in political science terms, there is a phrase called the Overton window, which you may or may not have heard of. And it basically describes the range of policies which are considered sufficiently mainstream that it is safe for a politician to espouse them. So to take, for example, going back to the death penalty example I used in Scandinavia, if a politician in one of those Scandinavian countries were to say that they were in favour of the death penalty, that would be considered unacceptable within polite discourse to say it, and they would find themselves a target for the media, they would find themselves a target for voters, and they would find it very, very difficult to continue their career in politics having expressed that particular opinion. And so politicians find themselves quite often in the past sticking to particular narrow opinions because they feel almost obliged to do so. And so that works for politicians, but when we go back to the people of a country, of course, popular opinion will have a much wider spectrum. There will be people who have views which are outside that Overton window, as it were. I'll come back to that in a moment. But effectively, it creates, again, a large number of people who feel that they can't change anything with their vote. And this effectively, I believe, is a very strong driver of polarization within Western politics. I think there's an element of reaction as well, that there's a mistrust of politicians. We've had various scandals. Again, they tend to be built up by the media to an extent because it's one of those things which sells newspapers. And also a rejection perhaps of political nepotism that you see, for example, from the Bush family in the United States. So you had George Bush Sr., George Bush Jr., and then when you look at others seeking elected office from the same family, it starts to be something which provokes a reaction. I think there's an element of the same thing even with Bill and Hillary Clinton in 2016. You see something of that as well. But I think perhaps there's something even stronger that causes this. It's social media. So when we look at Twitter, and particularly there is a difference culturally on Twitter. So it's very difficult to convey a nuanced message on Twitter in what was just 140 characters. And if you're coming from China, from Japan, from South Korea, then you can convey a lot of information in a few characters. But in terms of the Western alphabet, in just a few characters, you end up with very, very simplistic language simply because of the nature of Twitter. And they responded to that. Eventually, they doubled the character limit in the West. But before that, Twitter became a vehicle for very, very simple, decisive messages. Nuance wasn't possible. You couldn't explain an argument. So people who offered very simplistic solutions would find very much that those simplistic solutions were the ones that would be shared. And then we end up with this situation. There's quite a bit of academic research on this, where effectively you end up with what's known as an echo chamber, that people tend to follow others with similar opinions, and those who are more extreme tend to tweet more often. And so it leads to people not interacting with each other. And all of these disconnects, you've got the disconnect of policy from people. I think we've covered already. All of these sort of lead into the same kind of thing. I think probably the one which is often forgotten is language. So in the UK and across Europe, actually, there was a proposal, and I'm going to talk about football for a moment, and there's a reason. So there was a proposal just a couple of days ago for a European Football Super League, that the top clubs in various European nations would form their own league, which wouldn't have promotion from the Premier League, from the German Bundesliga or whatever, but it would be their own separate entity. And that was a proposal which went down incredibly badly across Europe. In the UK, the opinion polls were almost universally against it. Every political party was against it. In Europe, the European Commission was against it. It was an example of an issue where almost everybody universally held the same opinion. And so the difference then is only in the language that was used. I think the language is actually quite instructive. So the European Commission's response was quite technical. It spoke of protecting our European sports model, which relies on a balance between club and national competitions and is meant to ensure the development of the game in an open and non-discriminatory way. Now, there's nothing wrong with that statement in terms of putting across a point of view. But what it fails to do is reach somebody who's a football fan. So the voter who is concerned about it isn't reached by that language. It's the establishment form of language. And one thing that the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson did is he wrote about the plan in one of the UK's largest circulation daily newspapers, and he used a football analogy. He talked about showing a straight red card to the plan. He spoke about football fans, about how they interact with their clubs, how they care about their clubs. Both of those policies, or both of those opinions expressed by Boris Johnson and by the European Commission, they expressed the same issues. But one expressed it in establishment language. The other expressed it in populist language. And actually, that's quite a rare example where there was such a consensus that the only variable that we can look at is in terms of basically the rhetoric. And so I think we get these conditions in society that we start to have this feeling that politicians feel they can't break the mold. And so what Donald Trump did in America, and did quite cleverly in terms of what he did, whether it's a good thing or not is another matter, but his idea was to take the range of acceptable policies, and when somebody proposes a policy just outside of that, they try to shift that window a little bit. But what Donald Trump effectively did was start to propose policies which were a long way outside of that, deliberately using rhetoric which would be considered unacceptable rhetoric, doing it on purpose, with the idea that when he then proposed a policy that was not that far away from the consensus, but still a long way away from the previous consensus, he'd shifted the political discourse, he'd shifted the language. And this is a theory which has a lot of problems. The Overton window theory has a lot of problems, but it's also the one political science theory which was particularly taken very seriously by the Trump administration. And so it needs to be considered seriously in a political science context, because this is the theory which led to a lot of in effect, the politics followed the theory rather than necessarily the theory being correct. The politics followed the theory. The last thing I would say, and probably to get on to some predictions for the future and where we're going in the future, is that the good news in all of this is that there's a lot of cyclical tendencies in politics. So we often see, if you go back to the 1980s in the United Kingdom, we had a highly polarized situation with Margaret Thatcher on the one hand and Michael Foot on the other hand, and massive ideological differences between the two. Over the 1990s and 2000s, parties aimed for the centre ground of politics. That created the conditions for polarisation to occur again, but there's this, certainly there should be some reason to suppose that we should see that moving back in the other direction, that hopefully the toxic nature of polarisation should over time start to ease in a lot of ways. And I think it's possibly also fair to use the same sort of arguments in the United States. So looking at the approach that Bill Clinton took to getting elected, very much similar to the approach of someone like Tony Blair in the UK, who again went for this centre ground of politics idea. So again, we've got something which I think transcends national boundaries. So I think the first prediction really is that there will be a partial return to normality. I think with COVID, I think the pandemic has effectively shifted people's views. It's shifted the way that we perceive the world, but it's also driven forward effectively a process of moving away from other issues. It's taken the focus in America away from President Trump. That now that President Biden's been elected, the focus moves away from President Trump, particularly with the pandemic response. In the UK, the focus on Brexit seems to have subsided because of the focus on the pandemic. So effectively, we've got a little bit of a cooling off period in some ways. So I do expect at least a partial return to normality, that the polarization will come back in some form, that it won't stay quite like this forever. Second prediction is very much that social issues become the new battleground in Western politics. So approaches to race, to gender, to sexuality, to ethnicity, to freedom of speech, all of these are intertwined in various different ways. But the dividing lines on those have become wider than ever before. And in a sense, that seems to be something which on both sides, there's an intention to polarize. So I expect that we'll still see that polarization on social issues moving forward. And finally, I think in terms of Western nations and relationships with China, I suspect that we are entering a particularly difficult period in that sense. And we've certainly seen things move in that direction over time. But I think what probably we see is that there is no electoral benefit to a political party opposing a government which takes any measure which is negative towards China. So if a government says something negative or does something negative towards China, the opposition in those countries will not oppose them, because they feel that it is not to their political or electoral benefit to do so. And I suspect this is likely to be temporary, but I expect this to be the case over the next couple of years, because it's quite difficult for, at the moment, any action that a government takes does not receive scrutiny from the media and does not receive criticism. So I expect to see the tension between Western governments and the Chinese government to be something that I would expect to see continue for the next couple of years, simply because it doesn't fit into this model of politics. There is no opposition. There's no organized opposition in those situations. So I think those are basically my three predictions for the future. And of course, just looking at the time, I think I'd probably better wrap up and take any questions that you have. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Jonathan. And questions obviously are very welcome. And you can simply speak, or you can tap in your questions in the chat room. But for the first thing, because I was a journalist and I was a communication major, so I'm frankly interested in one of your particular points or causes of political polarization, which is social media. In your slide, you say social media and the incentivations of lying. Could you sort of elaborating more on that? What exactly you are referring to?
Okay, so I think there's a saying in the United Kingdom, which goes back centuries, that a lie can travel halfway around the world whilst the truth is still putting on its boots. And the idea is, I think, that when somebody makes a bold claim, a particularly bold claim, that because it is bold, it receives attention, it receives a large number of retweets, and it is passed on to millions of people very, very quickly. It's also very easy to say something which is a bold statement, because you can say it in a very small number of characters. You can make an accusation in just a couple of words. But to defend against that accusation, to show why it is false, to unpick it, takes a lot of words.
Serious work.
Even if you do that And even if you manage to do that within the Twitter character limit, you're still relying on those same people who retweeted the accusation, retweeting your defense. But of course, politically, those people will not do it because those people who retweeted the accusation are your opponents. And if your supporters retweet your defense, well, it's different people. So the people who saw the original accusation never see the rebuttal. So those politicians who come up with a very short, snappy way of saying things, irrespective of whether or not it is true, will often find that they get very good results. They generate more followers. They generate more coverage. They become much better known. But those who stick to facts and evidence are actually hampered by the very nature of Twitter, and in particularly the Western character limits.
Okay, and thank you. And we have a members of audience asking a questions in the chat box, and she asks, according to some news reports recently, U.S. Senate passed a bill asking the Biden administration to propose programs to sort of, what do you mean, to help the competitions with China, I guess, to be in a better position competing with China. And what do you think about it, and what side do you think European countries would need to take, or do they really need to take any side?
Okay, so you're asking me, I think, for a personal opinion in terms of how I feel about it, which I'm happy to give, but obviously I'm trying to be quite impartial in what I'm saying generally, so I'll give my personal opinion now. So my personal opinion is very much supportive of as much free trade as is reasonably possible between nations. So effectively, when the United Kingdom buys goods from China or sells goods to China, that is something which should be beneficial to both parties. There's various theorems in economics about this. It should be something which is of benefit on both sides. And so I'm always wary of anything which seeks to distort that. I'm wary of any proposals which perceive everything as being effectively a battle between one country and another. This is not what would be called in game theoretic terms a zero-sum game. It does not mean that if the USA gains something, that China loses something, or that if China gains something, the USA, by definition, loses something. I don't think it works like that. So my personal view is actually this isn't that. What you should be doing is you should be looking later, both move up rather than one move up at the expense of the other. Yeah. So I think that's how I perceive it. So on a personal point of view, I think my answer would be that I'm very much wary of that. I'm very much wary of too much politics getting involved in trade. Now, there are specific cases where I would disagree. So if you have a situation where a government is offering specific state subsidies and distorts the market, then in those situations, I think some counterbalance can be necessary. So I think, generally speaking, my view is 99% of the time, as much free trade between nations as possible, but there's also the 1%, it does need to be genuinely free trade. And I think when you look at the EU, so the second part of the question was do I think that the European Union may follow this? I think what we're starting to see in the European Union is probably a little bit of a split in terms of attitudes towards China. I think we've seen France and Germany have been very much resistant to hostility towards China. I think that resistance is probably weakening a little bit over time. A number of other countries are quite hostile at the moment, but I would say that there's probably a change in the opposite direction in the Eastern European countries, and particularly, I think that's one of the areas where there has been cooperation through the Belt and Road Initiative, through even through vaccines, where some of those European countries, and not all of those European countries are European Union countries either. So there are European countries which are not in the European Union. So it's some EU and some non-EU countries. But those that are in the EU will probably be resistant to hostility towards China. Now, within the European Union, because trade policy is decided at an EU level, then that means that it's really going to be a question of how the EU 27 all work together in that sense.
Yeah.
So I hope that answered the question. So it's just such a big question. Yeah.
It's all right, because just some personal observations. Because in Macau, we sometimes also see Portugal basically is quite a China-friendly EU countries, but it seems that considering recent developments, right, that's the room for maneuver is getting smaller and smaller, I must say, because as you said, trade policy are defined as EU level issue, right? And we have a members of audience, Yating, who would want to ask the questions. Yating, please.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for your very inspiring talk. My thought was jumping everywhere. Oh my goodness, so much to ask you.
Sorry about that.
No, thank you so much. About populism, I have so much colleagues who are working on this area. So if I'm not mistaken, President Donald Trump actually kind of used populism, like to manipulate the population, right, to get the votes, Actually, my question is, in China, if you know President Xi Jinping, since he took over power, and he proposed a concept, a diplomatic concept called building a community of shared future for humankind. So this concept is related to the One Belt, One Road initiative, to encourage people to, countries to collaborate together. I mean, even during the COVID-19, I saw the media even use this concept to advocate people, okay, not to fight with each other, not to blame China for the spread of COVID-19. So, and this concept is the dominant thought in President Xi's conceptual thought since he took over power. And this is the main difference between China and the Western, politics, the traditional kind of nation-state policy, right? Which is central on individualism, you win, I lost, that kind of mentality. But China, the community of shared future concept is emphasize collaboration, collectivism, so I guess this is the difference between China, and the Western, the nation-state diplomatic concept. And so today I saw the news, and actually a scholar here also mentioned that the recent Joe Biden's government, they kind of proposed some very sophisticated policy how to compete with China. And I also saw the news today, Australia is also following the USA to compete with China, right? I was very, very sad when I saw that, and so, and so my question is, going forward, what do you think, what's going to happen between China and, the Five Eyes, the Five Eyes countries. And yeah, so it's my question. Thank you.
China and Five Eyes, Jonathan.
Okay, and shall I also answer a couple of the other questions in the chat as well? That's yeah, but yeah. So just to take that question first of all, I think I really expect that for the next couple of years, I think there is going to be a substantial amount of tension. I think it will probably get a little bit worse over the next 2 years, but I think it will probably peak at some point, and then it will start coming back the other way and relations will start to normalize. And I think ultimately they will have to normalize. I don't see, I think when you look at the sheer size of the Chinese economy, when you look at the opinions of different countries to global challenges, the Chinese government's view of issues like climate change, for example, compared with the West, I think that over the next, say, 5 to 10 years, those relations will have to normalize. So and again, it's difficult because nobody can predict the future exactly, but my instinct, my political instinct, as it were, is that I expect relations between those nations and China to get worse for probably another 2 years, up to maybe 2023, and then start to gradually get better again. And I think we've also had, I think one thing that you see in politics is you see trigger points. You see particular things that cause something, and you hit on one of those. So you mentioned the trigger point of, you talked about the COVID-19 pandemic, and there has certainly been a concerted effort in some countries to, as it were, blame China. And blaming China because that's where it started seems ridiculous to me. I mean, in a sense, China's response and China's lockdown in Wuhan originally was one which no Western government could do, because any Western government which did that would have faced such hostility from the media for the harshness of the lockdown. And the Chinese government, I think this is the fundamental difference, is that the Chinese government perceives everything from on a generational perspective. It makes decisions today based on what it wants things to be like in 20, 30, 40 years' time. A Western government bases decisions on what they want things to be like at the time of the next election. And so they're coming at things from very different perspectives. And for that reason, it's actually quite difficult, I think, for Western politicians to understand the mindset in China. And it's quite difficult for the government in China to understand the mindset of Western politicians, because there's just simply that they're both just coming at things from not just different cultural views, but actually different fundamental approaches to the question of what is government for. And so some of the things that you mentioned from China's government, a lot of them have a very strong sense of nation. And in the West, things with strong sense of nation are perceived as this sort of right-wing populism, whatever. But actually, but then you've got China, the Communist Party of China proposes things that have got a strong sense of nation. And so again, it leads to this, and if you use the word communist in the West, it means something completely different to what it means in China. So I think this understanding is a very, very big thing. Just to pick up on two of the questions in the chat, what's my evaluation of the EU's Parliament's position towards the comprehensive agreement on investment between the EU and China? I think that agreement, I suspect, basically what the European Parliament does, and I've seen it so many times, every trade deal that it does, it tries to politicize that trade deal. So the European Union will have a trade deal with some other country if that country agrees to abide by what the EU standard is on a particular issue. And it tries to use trade as a lever. It tries to use trade to change policy within those countries. And it succeeds in doing that with smaller countries, but it does not succeed in doing that with larger economies. And so ultimately, the European Parliament needs to make a decision. Does it want to have this agreement, or doesn't it want to have this agreement? But I don't think it can expect to succeed in changing China's domestic policy. It might get some kind words. It might get some kind words from President Xi Jinping, but it will not get any substantive change on policy from China, because that's not how China. That's, to my mind, that's not how China works. So the European Union's got to make a decision, and the European Parliament will need to make a decision. The last question, the other question, am I going to get into UK politics? The answer to that is no at the moment, basically because there is no political party in the UK at the moment which I feel that I agree with enough to be able to support. And you have to feel that you agree with the policies you're putting forward if you're going to be honest. And I think we look at the direction that parties like UKIP went in. They went in quite a negative direction culturally. I couldn't follow them in that direction. And so at the moment, there isn't a political party that represents people like me. So I can't get into UK politics in any more detail. Do you want me to carry on going through a couple more of the questions in the chat, or?
Well, I think basically you address most of the points that members of audience, because you talk also a lot about China. Well, I think, but it's very interesting that you talk about sort of a disconnected language, disconnect of language between countries and the elite and the mass populations. But I think in the case of China, I guess there's also a intercontinental disconnect of language, because basically they speak very different language, right? And in Twitter, which is not really a comfort zone of Chinese authorities, right? I guess so. It also contributes to further polarizations, not only within the West, but more broadly within countries in different continents, shall I say. And I guess that's it for today's webinar. If Jonathan has nothing else to add, but I'm sure everyone can follow Jonathan's Twitter accounts and to follow his latest if possible. And I think that's it for now, and thank you very much. And we Fortunist Society will continue to have more webinars like the wonderful one we have tonight. Well, it's in Macau time, is nighttime already. And that's it for now, and thank you very much. And anything to add, Professor Wu?
No, nothing. I just want to thank Jonathan for his excellent, very inspiring talk, and we keep in touch.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you very much. And that's it. And we look forward to your continued participation and support. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.